Good afternoon. My name is Kimberly Foster, and today I will be presenting my signature project. So, in this presentation, I will talk about the problem that I identified within my classroom, talk about the data that I collected that led to that identifying that problem. Then I'm going to talk about the research that supports my plan of action, and then I'm going to talk about the plan of action. Then I'm going to consider the ethical and validity considerations, and then I'll end with hypothetical results and future considerations. So when I began analyzing my beginning of the year data, it really led to my choice of research. So one of the things that we do is we do a beginning of the year screener for DIBELS, where our reading coach pulls all of our students and she does the DIBELS test for them. And then we also give an iReady diagnostic, which measures performance in phonics and comprehension skills. And whenever I was analyzing that data, it just became very clear to me that a good portion of my class was not where they needed to be for comprehension and phonics. And a lot of that goes hand in hand because if a student can't decode, they're not going to be able to comprehend. And so I actually found, if you look in the data chart below, I found that 31% of my students were well below benchmark in comprehension, and more than half of my class was below grade level in comprehension overall, which obviously set off a red flag for me. And then I also found that 40% of my students performed below the grade level expectation in decoding. So these obviously indicate that what I was doing in whole group was not working and that there was need for more instruction in these areas. So as I mentioned, the data that I collected confirmed the need for more instruction in these areas and more targeted instruction. So these patterns revealed that comprehension was the greatest area in need of support, and then that phonics skills such as decoding were a close second. I had very few students at the beginning of the year who were performing at or above grade level for both of these domains. So it just suggests that there was an overall gap that needed to be filled. The research that I used to support this was Scarborough's reading rope, which tells us that a weakness in phonics directly correlates with a weakness in comprehension, which is like I was saying earlier, if a student is not able to decode the words to get them off of the page, they're not going to be able to understand what they're reading. So this data definitely supports that my students needed more targeted and differentiated instruction. Through my literature review, I used a few different theorists and used their framework to kind of support my approach of using small group instruction. So one of the ones that I chose to use was Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, which is heavily emphasizing scaffolding. So it means that you meet the student where they are and you do what you can to help fill the gaps. So that definitely goes along with what I'm doing here because my students have a gap and a deficiency in comprehension and phonics skills. So I'm not going to be able to just start teaching them second grade material. I'm going to have to go back to where their deficiency is and fill the gap before I can proceed. And then I also use Scarborough's reading rope, which I was just talking about. So that one talks about how comprehension and decoding go hand in hand. Without one, you're not going to be a proficient reader. So they have to be able to decode and comprehend in order to become a skilled reader. And then I also looked at the gradual release of responsibility model. So that just emphasizes gradually releasing control to the student. So you begin by modeling, and then you do guided practice, and then independent practice. And you just kind of go back and forth between that guided and independent until a student is able to perform on their own. So together, these theories revealed that small group instruction gives me a better opportunity to scaffold my instruction. I'm able to give more targeted support to those areas of deficiency, and it's an increased chance for me to give guided instruction because in a whole group setting, it's not always as easy to give each student exactly what they need. And so in a small group setting, I can support students better. So based on the data and the research, the biggest problem that I identified in my class was that a lot of my students were not where I needed them to be in comprehension and phonics. So the purpose of this study was just to see if implementing a small group instruction would improve my reading outcomes in my class compared to just solely using whole group instruction. And I feel like it's important to note in a lot of elementary classrooms, it's a requirement from the school or from the school system to implement small group instruction. In the school that I work for, it's not required. It is encouraged and it's suggested to us, but ultimately it's not a requirement. And so we kind of just do what our students need. So with a class like what I have this year, definitely I would implement small group instruction. That just is not the case for every teacher on our grade level. I feel like that needed to be said for the rest of this presentation to make sense. So like I said, this plan is going to be used to compare the effectiveness of small group instruction with whole group instruction. So I'm going to measure the impact of reading fluency, decoding, comprehension, and just overall skill mastery of the weekly reading skills, and use that to determine whether this targeted small group intervention leads to stronger gains in the students than compared to just solely using whole group instruction. So for the sample that I chose to use for this project, it includes 32 second grade students. They are split between 2 classrooms, and me and the other teacher have 16 students each so that it's equal. We both have a variety of needs within our classroom, which includes students that have IEPs or 504s, and we have different Tier 3 intervention students. I used a very purposeful sampling method just to ensure that things were as fair as possible. So with us teaching the same grade level, we teach the same curriculum, we follow the same pacing guide, we use the same resources, and so I felt like that was the most fair method to use. I feel like it's justified using the sampling method because both of our classrooms, like I said, follow the same pacing guide and curriculum. With this particular teacher, it's actually even more fair because we went to college together, we graduated together, and we've done every professional development from college to now together. So I feel like out of all of the people that I work with, she is the most like me as far as training and experience. And so I felt like that was as fair as I could be. We also do common assessments across our grade level, so we will be on the same skills, same everything every week. I just think that these extra measures kind of help to reduce the amount of variations in the study and helps maintain consistency. So that is why I was very intentional with picking this other teacher in her classroom, just to kind of keep things as fair as possible. So the instruments that we used for assessment was the DIBELS and iReady diagnostics. We give those at the beginning of the year. And then I also created a pre and post test that would be given for this. They would be a different test, but very similar, kind of like a Form A, Form B kind of situation. So for this study, I would need to collaborate with another grade level colleague. So to keep it, like I said, the most fair and consistent, we would plan together to ensure that we were using the same materials and same assessments throughout the different lessons. I think that the more we collaborate, the more reliable the study will be, and that both classes would be receiving high quality instruction, but that it would be the most consistent between the two of us if we plan together. So for the study, we would start by giving both sets of classes a pre-test. Then we would begin 3 weeks of instruction using whichever method we were using. So I would be using solely small group instruction for reading comprehension and phonics skills, and she would be using whole group instruction. And then we would do weekly progress monitoring, so not a full DIBELS, but we would do nonsense fluency and oral reading fluency and measure that weekly. Then following the 3 weeks of instruction, we would give a very similar test to the pre-test, but it would be different questions, kind of like a Form A, Form B like I was talking about earlier. So we would administer the post-test, and then afterwards I would take the data that's collected and analyze it and look for different trends or growth patterns, and then obviously report my results. So there are a few things to consider as far as validity goes. So internally, we are different teachers, and so we will have different teaching strategies and different teaching methods. Just you can't regulate every single thing when it comes to that. Also, we do have a different set of students. So the 16 kids in my class are not going to be the same 16 kids in her class. We're going to have different home lives, different motivations, reading levels, all of the different things. So, in order to kind of mitigate that and kind of control it as much as possible, we will be using the exact same materials and strategies as far as we can. So, that would include planning together, only using designated resources and using them to fidelity. There are a few considerations externally as well. So, for example, our sample size is only 2 classrooms, and if you just consider my grade level, there are 14 second grade teachers on my grade level. So, even just picking 2, that's not fairly representing the entire grade level. We are also one school, and we are a city school for that. We're the only elementary school in our district, and we are only one school in one small town part of Alabama. So it would be hard to generalize our findings statewide or even countrywide. I still do think that this research is highly relevant because it will provide data to the teacher and to the school on instructional methods, which could be used. Like I said, my school doesn't require a small group, but if a finding like this shows a significant growth pattern, it might influence my school to make that a requirement. So I think it is still highly relevant. There are things to consider as far as ethics go as well. So, for one thing, the study subjects are minors. So, in order to use them in the study, we would have to get parental consent. The adults in the study would also need to consent. And also, confidentiality of the students is important. So, making sure that their names are not on things, making sure that we were using like student 1, 2, 3, 4, like that, instead of using their real actual names in the study. And then parental consent really is a priority with this. Also, the Institutional Review Board and IEP and 504 accommodations or modifications are very important because you, as a teacher, definitely want to make sure that you don't violate an IEP or 504. So if a student is supposed to have an accommodation or modification, like we want to make sure that we are maintaining what is within their IEPs and 504s. So if I were to actually implement this study, I would expect that the small group instruction would demonstrate greater gains than whole group instruction. So it would be hard to put an exact percentage on it, but I think that there would be an increase in decoding skills, which would ultimately improve comprehension as well, because the more they're able to get off the page, the more they're able to comprehend. And just a small group setting makes it easier to accommodate for the children and to meet them where they are. So I just think that that group would yield higher growth. So with this research, I think that student achievement would be measurable by looking at how many students were below or well below grade level at the beginning versus after the 3-week instruction period, how many were in the same point or where they had grown. I also think that looking at those pre and post assessments, you would see that after the 3-week period, both classes would probably grow in comprehension by getting more questions correct. But I think that the class that had small group instruction would obviously be more successful on the post test. Also, looking at DIBELS and that progress monitoring, I think that students who had the small group instruction would have greater growth in oral reading fluency and nonsense word fluency. After looking closer at my research strategies, I think that one of the things that I would change is the intervention time. So originally I chose 3 weeks, but I think looking back at this, that 3 weeks is not enough time, that I would need to extend that to maybe like a whole quarter of 9 weeks. I also think that fidelity checks would be a really good way to ensure equality between the 2 classes. So just making sure that we are using the same materials and that we aren't supplementing with other things. And that we just stay within what the agreed upon materials. Also, student motivators. I think that motivating the students to grow and to seek success would be really important because if students aren't motivated, they're not going to do what's being asked of them. Also, I think that not only focusing on strictly comprehension skills or strictly phonics skills, but trying to work in all of those sub-skills that are being taught every week would be a great addition to this. If we were to extend this, I think we would look at the long-term benefits of small group instruction. I would also want to look at tech assistance to see if there were any kind of programs or anything that I could implement to help increase growth. Also, motivation effects. I was looking kind of just to see, does small group instruction, does that small group setting help the teacher hold the student more accountable, which motivates them more versus whole group instruction. Also, I was thinking of more open research. So, like I said, I do have 14 people on my grade level, or 14 teachers on my grade level. So, I think that having a more broad sample would it would yield data that would be more easily generalized. And this is a list of my resources that were used for this project. Thank you for listening.